questions in a minute on that. But lastly, we have Giedre, who's going to talk about, as it were, from a private sector advisor perspective in DFID, and tell us a little bit about the planned climate public-private partnership. Giedre,
thank you very much. I will need to move chairs because I only found out about this yesterday, so I haven't got a presentation, I've got notes. Also, I've just come back from maternity leave, so if I burst into Baba Black Sheep, just realized I've temporarily forgotten where I am, and please forgive me. I'm also very grateful to Radhika, who pushed CP3 in my absence and did a very quick update so that I'm speaking mostly thanks to her. And if there are any difficult questions, please direct them towards her. All the easy ones towards me. CP3, as Tamsin mentioned, is a practical case study, something that DFID is working on at the moment together with the Asian Development Bank, and we're hoping to launch it sooner rather than later. We think it would provide a very useful case study, as Tamsin mentioned, both for the design of the Green Fund and for the UK's International Climate Fund, possibly feeding in lessons learned into it. Just to give you a little bit of history, and really some of this is set out in the note, and I think the note very usefully picks up the actual fund structure, and I'll kind of refer to it as we go through it. But the way the CP3 idea was born was that in October 2009 there was a P8 summit in London. P8 is a group of 12, and I think possibly even more now, institutional investors, mostly pension funds, with very big asset bases. Between them, they control in excess of $3 trillion. I'm sure that reduced with the crisis. I'm hoping that it's all picking up now, but we're talking very large capital base, and they were raising the issue of the fact that they're very interested in the low carbon investment field. They obviously don't view it from our point of view, so it is not for them about reducing climate change, about reaching targets and so on. It's simply as part of their portfolio management structure, they would be interested in low carbon investments, and as one new area of investing. However, while having all this capital available, they were flagging to us that at the moment, the low carbon investments in the developing countries, for them, are treated as equity type investments, i.e. very high risk investments, rather than infrastructure type investments, which would be, an infrastructure type investment is when you invest into existing assets, such as roads, bridges, etc. Because this is such a new type of technology in the developing countries, they would treat this as equity type investments, would expect extremely high returns between 18–25%, and it's simply not worth it for them to invest. So we started the dialogue with them as to what would be a practical way for a donor type institution to address this. And we really looked at 3 areas. The first one was capital. So while we have this capital available, it can't be unlocked unless there is public sector capital coming in, not necessarily on concessional terms, and we'll discuss that a little bit later, but alongside private sector. Really, the term that we had time and time again was skin in the game. Are the donors prepared to have skin in the game, put in their own capital alongside us, go into the developing countries? Because if not, we're not interested either. The other thing they flagged is absence of viable projects. These are enormous institutions with usually very small internal investment management groups who, are not interested in a small solar project here and there. They want big programs or big projects. Therefore, kind of the absence of a viable project pipeline was flagged as another big barrier. The third barrier is really around the risks. So in addition to your usual risks that you have associated with investing in the developing countries, absence of reliable business investment environments, political risk, etc., you also have the risks of untested technologies, unstable regulatory regimes, or just nascent regulatory regimes. So we were wondering what would be the best way of packaging our interventions to address these three levels of risk. So that's capital risk, project risk, the fact that there are no projects, and the general risk of investing in low carbon in the developing countries. The CP3 structure is very helpfully put in the note, and that's on page 5. And I won't really go through it. I'll just very briefly flag what the structure involves. I mean, this is really, we like to call it a fund of intermediaries. That's really because it involves the public sector investing alongside institutional investors in one fund that would invest in further funds that would then invest directly into individual projects. The subsidy, and I really don't want to use that term because we want this to be as limited concessionality terms as possible, but if you like, the public interventions rather than subsidy would be at the equity level in the CP3 fund itself. There would be technical assistance, and that would be concessional in helping to build up the project pipeline, build capacity, etc. And then there would be risk mitigation instruments brought in by IFIs, in this particular case, the Asian Development Bank, to help de-risk the specific investments. Now, the focus initially is on Asia, but as I'll mention, I think this, this offers a very interesting structure that can be replicated with significant tweaks in other regions. Now, I think the key takeaways that we've taken so far from working on CP3 is that designing your concessionality is key, because you don't want to over-subsidize in order not to crowd out the private sector. There's a lot of requests from some institutions for first loss, and I think what you described in East Africa is extremely relevant, and I think those probably are the areas where you will need first loss. Not necessarily in a lot of the countries in Asia, where first loss will not be always required, in fact may not be required at all. Rather, you really need to think about whether just the actual presence of the donor alongside the private sector might be enough. On the other hand, as Jessica flags in the paper, the actual nature of IFIs, the ability to take on a bit more risk, provide investments for longer tenors because of their AAA rating, is an additional factor. So we are very careful in the way we're designing the public interventions. I think, as you mentioned, additionality is going to be key. I think leverage alone will not be enough to measure what is achieved, particularly if we try to integrate structures such as CP3 into the Green Fund or into the UK's general approach to how we decide on what is invested into or not. I think we will need to work up that methodology much more carefully. Another key feature, I think, another lesson we've learned really along the lines is that you can't, we do, but we shouldn't, as civil servants, speak about the private sector as this one homogeneous entity. Even within pension funds, which you would have thought is just one type of investor, you'll have different types of investors. You'll have smaller ones who will be interested in investing through funds because they have very small management teams and they like to offload that responsibility to other funds. Other bigger institutional investors will want to control investments themselves, and they will be more interested in the co-investment type structures. You also need to be very careful about the region that you're working in. So as I was mentioning, I think CP3 could not be lifted and just planted in Africa. The projects in Africa will be much smaller. There therefore may need to be additional features such as carbon offtake facilities or whatever to enhance the attractiveness of CP3 type structures to institutional investors. I think there will, it's very important to strike a balance between in these type of structures where you're cooperating with the private sector, between the needs of the private sector, which is satisfactory returns, and our needs. So, for example, we will try to combine developmental outcomes with low carbon outcomes. So reduction of carbon for us will need to go hand in hand with developmental benefits, something that obviously the private sector will not be viewing as a priority because they are focused on investment outcomes. Likewise for us, the building up, incubating local funds will always be extremely important, because we want to have I loved Jessica's term, what was it, the investment, the leverage feedback loop. I think that's very right, because the feedback loop will help to bring down the cost of projects, but will also bring the local capacity, so that these interventions by donors will be minimized as we go along, and the projects will develop of their own right. And finally, my last takeaway would be that we need to be very careful on technical assistance, what it is that we provide. And I think it's very important to work with the private sector in designing that. I think so far we've always talked about capacity building. That's a very developmental term. For the private sector, they always ask us, what is it that you mean by capacity building? And while we think about constructing the national low carbon development programs, the private sector thinks of capacity building as actually developing the project pipeline, and that's what they will need. Again, this is a very clear case for dialogue and working out where the donor interventions will be needed. So we hope that CP3 as CMCI is very much work in progress. We hope to be launching soon, but a lot remains to be done. But I think if it is successful, then that will be extremely useful for the general climate debate, because we hope it will help to demonstrate how quite limited public seed financing can leverage significant amounts of private finance.
Great. Giedre, thank you very much. That's fantastic and very impressive after 3 days back in the job. Thank you very much.